But he did, and the next, and the next, until on the 5th visit, Silas spoke without looking up from his plate. If you need work, I got a place. Don't need a servant. Need someone who knows soup and silence. She looked at Buckley. He didn't argue. She cooks better than most. He muttered, maybe better than you deserve. So Nora packed her spoon, her notebook, her wedding dress, and followed Silas out of town. No promises, no expectations, just 3 miles of quiet road and the sound of 2 horses walking side by side. His homestead lay between rock hills and cottonwoods, a main cabin, a woodshed, a smaller shack with a porch barely wider than a saddle. My wife's, he said. I haven't opened it in years. You can have it. She said, thank you, stepped inside, and placed the spoon on the table like a flag planted in new soil. The first morning, she woke to birdsong and the smell of cedar. She boiled water on the old stove and walked to the main house with 2 cups of tea. Silas was already chopping wood. He took the cup, nodded, and kept chopping. Nora didn't ask for chores, but she found them. She mended his shirts, cleaned the smoke-black pot, and patched a saddlebag until it looked like new. They barely spoke, but every evening he left something on her porch, a biscuit, a folded note. One day, a single egg in a tin cup. She returned the gestures with stew, bread, and the occasional pie made from nothing but dried apples and memory. The 3rd week, he looked up from his bench and said, I'm building a new cabin. She raised a brow. For what? That shack was for drifters, not for someone who bakes bread and stitches curtains. She didn't know whether to be flattered or offended. I didn't ask for anything permanent. You didn't, he said, but you deserve it. What do you think I am, Mr. Hart? She asked quietly. He didn't flinch. A woman who's been given less than she earned, who crossed the desert with nothing but a spoon and silence. That's something. She stared at him. And what do I owe for this generous cabin? Nothing, he said. You help if you want. Cook, mend things. I don't keep accounts. So she stayed, not as a guest, not as a cook, as someone beginning again. The days took on rhythm. Morning tea, afternoon repairs, quiet dinners at his table. By the 5th week, the cabin's walls stood tall, framed by Nora's curtains and her laughter echoing from the kitchen. When a storm blew in from the north, Silas stood at her door with a wool blanket. You'll be cold, he said. I'm fine. Still, he replied. Take it. She did. One night, they sat beside the hearth, fire low, hands quiet. She asked, Why me? He shrugged. You don't talk unless you mean it. And you make cornbread like it's sacred. She smiled. And you? I fix things. I stay put. That's all I know. That winter, when the snow came, they built a path between their doors. No need for it. Just habit. Just a way of saying, I'm here. Nora Elwood had seen her share of broken roofs and cold porches, but Silas Hart's place was different. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused. The bunkhouse he offered her smelled of cedar dust and memory. On the wall, a coat hook still held a faded shawl. On the shelf, an empty vase waited as if spring had just been late. Nora unpacked without ceremony. One dress, one spoon, a threadbare journal. She placed the silver spoon on the nightstand, facing the window that caught the western sky just before sunset. Then she sat at the small table, let her fingers rest on the wood grain, and simply breathed. She didn't know if this place was safe, but for the first time in months, it wasn't threatening. Silas did not speak much. True to his reputation, he left her be most of that first day, save for a quiet knock before supper. He stood at the threshold of her cabin with a tin plate and said, "Chicken stew, no onions." She nodded, accepted it, thanked him. He nodded back and walked away. That night, Nora ate slowly. The chicken was tough, but the effort was clear. She washed the plate herself and set it out on the porch. By morning, it was gone. Their rhythm fell into place without needing to be spoken. She cooked breakfast, cornbread, and eggs. He tended to the horses and chopped wood. She swept the main house and repaired curtains. He fixed the porch steps and salted the well. There was no talk of wages, no contract, just a quiet agreement written in motion and gesture. 3 days in, Silas brought her a small basket of potatoes and a crooked smile. If you know how to make them less awful, you're already doing better than I have. She didn't laugh aloud, but something softened in her chest. She boiled them with rosemary and garlic and left a bowl on his windowsill. The next morning, a note lay beside it in blocky handwriting. "Didn't think I'd ever like potatoes again. Thanks." She didn't ask why. She didn't ask anything. But questions hung in the air like dust in sunbeams. Who taught him to smile like that? What happened to the woman who once lived here? Why had he waited so long to speak to someone again? One morning, Nora awoke to the sound of hammering. She pulled her shawl over her shoulders and stepped outside. Silas was building something between her bunkhouse and the barn, a low foundation, stakes in the earth, a pile of timber beside it. She approached slowly, unsure. He didn't look up right away, just kept driving nails like the earth had asked him to. Finally, he said, "It'll be a kitchen. One that doesn't smoke you out every time you boil a pot." She opened her mouth, then closed it. "Thank you," she said after a long pause. He nodded. As the weeks passed, the walls rose. She helped when she could, measured boards, held beams steady. Her hands calloused again, but this time it felt earned. Each evening, they sat in silence, drinking tea or black coffee, sometimes on her porch, sometimes by the fire in the main house. Occasionally, a question would slip through. "Do you miss the city?" he asked one evening. Out of nowhere, she thought for a long while before answering. "I miss the anonymity, the way people let you disappear. Here, even your silence is noticed." He nodded. "That's not always bad." He didn't speak of his past, not directly, but she saw it in the way he looked at the hills at dusk, in the way he ran his thumb along a crack in the table before sitting, in the way he never touched the piano in the corner of the room, though it was perfectly tuned. One afternoon, Silas returned from town with a bolt of blue fabric. Didn't say a word, just handed it to her and pointed at the window in her bunkhouse. "Figured you'd want something nicer to frame the light." She ran her hand along the cloth, surprised at the softness, the shade. It was the same blue as the sky on the morning her husband left for war. She stitched quietly that night, and when the curtain was hung, the room felt like hers for the first time. But silence does not mean emptiness, and peace, Nora knew, was always temporary. One evening, as she was baking bread, a horse galloped into the yard. A young rider, dust-covered and wild-eyed, called out, "Fire near Dry Creek, winds pushing it west." Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and saddle. Before he mounted, he looked at Nora and said, "If it gets close, take the mule and ride into Redwind. Don't wait for me." She nodded, though her hands trembled. That night, she stayed awake with buckets of water by the porch and the scent of smoke growing stronger in the wind. She soaked blankets, covered the door, whispered to herself that this was not London, not the past. She would not be helpless again. The fire never reached them. By dawn, the wind had turned. Silas returned just after sunrise, ash-streaked and exhausted. She ran to him, didn't ask questions, just wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and said, "Tea or whiskey?" He chuckled weakly. "Both, if you've got it." She helped him inside, cleaned the cuts on his hands, sat beside him as he rested. That night, he didn't return to the main house. Instead, he slept on the floor of her bunkhouse, not speaking, not touching, just sharing the same warmth under the same silence. Something had changed, but they didn't name it. Not yet. Not out loud. The morning after the fire, the valley looked different. Maybe it was just the light, or maybe it was something subtler, like when you wake from a dream you don't remember but still feel. Nora rose before Silas and watched the frost lift from the grass. His boots were still by the door, his coat folded neatly over a chair. He hadn't said anything before falling asleep on her floor, and she hadn't asked him to leave. It was enough that he'd come back, that he was still breathing. She made coffee and stirred it slowly, listening to the kettle hiss and the wind tickle the corners of the bunkhouse. Silas stirred just as she poured his cup. He sat up, rubbing the back of his neck, eyes heavy with the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from a single night's ride, but from years of carrying things you can't put down. She handed him the mug. He accepted it wordlessly, sipped once, then said, "That's the second best thing I've had this week." She raised a brow. "And the first? You still haven't told me your biscuit recipe." Nora gave a quiet laugh and sat across from him. They drank together in silence. It was the kind of silence that asked nothing, demanded nothing, but gave everything. Later that day, Silas returned to work on the kitchen. He moved slower, but still with purpose. Nora joined him, sweeping sawdust and holding planks. As the walls rose higher, so did something else, something that lived in glances, in small touches. When she brushed past him to reach for a hammer, he didn't move away. When he passed her a nail, his fingers lingered just long enough to be noticed. But nothing was said. By the end of the week, the new kitchen had a roof. Silas brought her a hook for hanging herbs and a shelf for her spices. No explanations, just offerings, like birds bringing twigs to a nest. One evening, he came to her porch, holding something wrapped in canvas. "Found it in the loft," he said. "Thought maybe you'd make better use of it." Inside was a cast-iron skillet, well-worn but cared for. She traced the edge with her fingers. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He nodded. "Belonged to my wife." Nora paused, then met his eyes. "Are you sure?" He didn't look away. "She'd have liked you." It was the first time he'd mentioned her. Nora didn't ask more. She didn't need to. Some griefs don't belong to questions. Spring crept in slow. The last of the snow melted into the soil, and the trees began their cautious bloom. Nora planted rosemary beside the porch, tying little red ribbons on the branches like she used to do with her mother. She found comfort in the rhythm of days. Firewood in the morning, bread in the afternoon, tea and shared silence in the evening. One Sunday, Silas didn't come for supper. She waited an hour before walking over to the main house. She found him on the porch, holding a small box wrapped in burlap. He didn't speak as she approached, just patted the spot beside him. She sat. He handed her the box. Inside was a silver brooch, a little bent, but still lovely. I never gave her anything fancy, he said. We didn't have the kind of life for it. She wore this when we went into town. Nora held it gently, uncertain. I can't. It's not for wearing, he interrupted. I thought maybe you'd fix it. I figured you might know how to restore things. She looked at him, and for once, he didn't hide behind a shadow or a breath. He let her see him, open, unshielded. She placed the brooch in her lap and covered it with her hand. I'll do my best. The next day, she repaired the clasp, polished the silver, and pinned it to a strip of linen that hung near her window. It caught the morning light like a whisper of something both past and possible. The cabin became more than just walls. It became memory. Nora began to sew curtains from the blue fabric Silas had given her, trimming them with lace from her old dress. She baked for the first time without needing a reason, just because it was Wednesday, and the dough rose well. One afternoon, as she set a pie on the windowsill to cool, Silas appeared with a package wrapped in brown paper. No note, just a quiet nod. She opened it after he left, spools of thread, a new pair of scissors, and a folded apron stitched with her initials. That night, she walked over to the main house, pie in hand, and stood in the doorway. You keep bringing me things, she said softly. You keep staying, he replied. She stepped in. They ate in silence, then shared a mug of coffee by the fire. Nora turned to him as he washed the dishes. Why didn't you leave all this behind after she died? He paused. I did, he said, until you showed up with that spoon in your pocket and soup on your breath. She smiled. And now? He shrugged, drying a plate. I figured it might be time to set the table again. Days folded into each other the way dough folds into itself, soft, slow, and inevitable. By late April, the ground was firm enough for planting, and Nora found herself kneeling beside Silas in the small garden behind the main house. Fingers deep in soil, sunlight warming her shoulders. He handed her a trowel without looking, and she took it with a nod. They didn't speak much when they worked side by side, but that didn't mean they weren't saying things. She planted rosemary, carrots, and something Silas only called the red ones, which turned out to be beets. He hated beets. She loved them. That felt like balance. One evening after supper, Silas was sharpening an axe while Nora sat nearby, mending the hem of one of his shirts. You don't have to fix everything, he said, not looking up. She tied a knot in the thread and replied, No, but I want to. He stopped, met her eyes, and gave a slow nod. Then I suppose I'll keep dulling blades just to give you something to work on. She smiled. Not everything needs fixing. Some things just need to be used gently. That night, he lingered longer by her porch. He didn't come inside, didn't ask to stay, but he leaned against the frame of her doorway while she lit the oil lamp. She set a second mug on the windowsill. It's chamomile, she said, for the kind of silence that lets us sleep. He took the mug and drank, eyes following the shadows on her wall. A week later, he asked her to ride into town with him. Supplies, he said, and maybe lunch. She agreed, though her chest tightened at the thought of Redwind, the stairs, the whispers, the things people remember about strangers who look too comfortable in other people's spaces. They rode in early, when the market stalls still smelled like morning bread. Silas bought nails and lantern oil. Nora found cinnamon and 3 spools of thread in colors she hadn't seen since she left the city. At the cafe, he ordered 2 meat pies and let her choose the tea. They ate on the porch, watching wagons roll past. 2 women stared as they passed. One murmured something, the other narrowed her eyes. Nora's spine stiffened. Silas noticed. Want to go? He asked. No. she said. Let them wonder. On the way back, they rode in silence until Nora said, "You didn't flinch when they looked." He shrugged. "I know who I am." "And you?" She hesitated. "I'm still remembering." He looked at her then, long enough for her to feel it behind her ribs. "I can wait," he said. That night, she returned to the bunkhouse and found a wooden box on her doorstep. Inside was a carved sign, Nora's Kitchen. The lettering was uneven, the stain still fresh. She ran her fingers over it, and for the first time in a long time, she cried, not from sorrow, but from the weight of being seen. They hung the sign together the next morning. Silas held the hammer. She held the board steady. When it was in place, he stepped back and said, "That's better." It was, in every way. Spring deepened. The air grew sweeter. They planted more, fixed fence posts, shared more meals. One afternoon, she found him sanding a long wooden beam. "What's that for?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Then, "A table? For what? For everything." The table took 3 days. Nora made the cloth for it, blue, with red stitching at the corners. When they set it up under the big cottonwood tree, she brought out 2 bowls, 2 mugs, and a pie still warm from the oven. They ate with the sun at their backs and a breeze in their hair. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Once. And now? I think you brought everything I thought I'd have to find somewhere else." "That's dangerous," she said. "People like me don't stay long." He looked at her, steady. "Then I'll just build wherever you go." The next morning, she found a folded piece of parchment tucked beneath her coffee mug. It read, "You sow the way some folks pray." She read it 3 times before tucking it in the pocket of her apron. That evening, she baked bread and waited on the porch. Silas arrived just as the sun dipped low. She handed him a plate and a question. "What would happen if I said I wanted more than this?" He took the plate. "More how? More time, more mornings, maybe more rooms." He chewed his bread slowly. "Then I'd say I've been hoping you'd ask. No fanfare, no poetry, just a man who hammered slowly, lived quietly, and built what needed building." They spent that night talking in low voices, seated on the porch with their knees nearly touching, the stars blinking like old friends overhead. When she finally stood to go in, she touched his shoulder and said, "You should sleep here tonight, not because the bunkhouse is full, but because the space beside me isn't." Silas didn't say anything when she invited him to stay that night. He just followed her inside, set his boots by the door, and folded his coat over the chair. Nora lit a single oil lamp and moved through the small space like she always had, but everything felt different. The silence wasn't absence. It was presence. He sat on the edge of the cot while she tidied the dishes, as if they'd done this routine for years. She handed him a folded quilt. He spread it at the foot of the bed and didn't ask where he was meant to sleep. When she slid beneath the covers, he joined her, both of them facing the same direction, backs to the window, bodies still separated by a few inches of wool and worry. Neither reached out. Neither spoke, but their breathing aligned, and that was enough. The days that followed weren't marked by declarations, only decisions. Nora made extra coffee in the morning. Silas added a second hook beside the door for her shawl. She cleared space in her cupboard without telling him. He placed his shaving kit beside her hairbrush without asking. And one morning, when she returned from gathering eggs, she found his boots neatly placed beside hers. a house with two shadows at the threshold. It didn't escape the town's attention. Miss Darnell from the general store began packing their flour and salt into a single sack. The postmaster asked if they'd like their mail addressed jointly. Buckley Stanton nodded once when he passed them in town and said, "Figured it'd be you two." Nora only smiled, half shy, half proud. Silas just tipped his hat. They spent a Sunday painting the cabin's porch. Nora chose a pale sage color. Silas grumbled that it would stain, but when she stood back and smiled at the finished railing, he admitted it looked just fine. Later, as the paint dried, they sat on the steps drinking lemonade and watching two deer pick their way across the far field. Nora said, "I never thought life would be this quiet." Silas replied, "I never thought quiet could feel like company." That evening, a storm rolled in from the east. Heavy clouds, long rumbles. Nora stood by the window, one hand resting on the sill, remembering the last time thunder made her flinch. Silas came up behind her, not touching, just standing close enough for her to feel the calm in his stillness. "You're safe here," he said. She nodded. "I believe you." When the rain came, they didn't move, just stood together, listening. A week later, Silas handed her a small bundle wrapped in flannel. She opened it and found a simple necklace, a carved wooden pendant in the shape of a sprig of rosemary. "I carved it from that branch you planted," he said. "Didn't want you thinking it went unnoticed." Nora traced the shape with her fingers. "I thought you hated beets," she replied. He smirked. "I do, but I love that you planted them anyway." That night, she wore the necklace while baking bread. When he came into the kitchen and saw it, he didn't say anything. He just reached for the apron hanging by the door, tied it around his waist, and began chopping onions. "You're crying," she teased. "That's the onions talking," he said. Their world became small but full. A creaking porch, a soft bed, bread cooling on the windowsill. Sometimes they worked side by side without speaking for hours. Sometimes one of them would say something like, "Remember that spring where the well froze?" And they'd laugh like they had decades to look back on. But not every visitor was welcome. Late one afternoon, a rider arrived, dusty, hurried, carrying a letter. "From Helena," he said. "Looks official." Nora opened it slowly. Her stomach tightened. It was from a solicitor, a notice of claim. Her late husband's estate had been reopened. Someone wanted her signature. Someone knew she was still alive. She sat on the porch bench, letter in her lap, hands still. Silas knelt beside her, reading the worry in her face before reading the paper itself. "Do we fight it?" he asked. Nora looked at him. "We don't run anymore." That was the only answer he needed. They rode into town together the next morning. Sheriff Denton listened, read the letter, then said, "If they come here, they'll find you're not alone. And this place isn't the kind of place where papers matter more than people." Nora thanked him, but her hands still trembled as they left. That night, she didn't sleep. Neither did Silas. They sat by the fire in the main house, her head on his shoulder, his hand resting over hers. "I'm not scared of losing things anymore," she whispered, "but I'm scared of losing this." He looked at her. "Then let's build something they can't touch." The next morning, Silas was already outside, hammer in hand, laying out the plans for another addition to the cabin, a second room, a porch swing, a place for bookshelves, not because they needed more space, but because they were making space for tomorrow, for days not yet spoken. The addition didn't rise in a single weekend. It came together the way some things should, slowly, with hands that learned each other's rhythm. Nora held beams while Silas nailed them in place. He planed the floorboards. She swept the sawdust. Sometimes they worked in silence. Other times she hummed old lullabies her mother once sang while sewing late into the night. He didn't ask for words. She didn't offer any unless they meant something. In the evenings, they sat on the porch swing, the new one he hung with rope thick as a man's wrist. They shared tea or black coffee, watched the sky soften. One night, she turned to him, resting her bare feet against the wooden rail, and asked, "What would you have done if I hadn't come?" He was quiet a long while, probably just kept hammering things that didn't need fixing. She smiled. "And now I fix what's mine." She didn't answer, but her hand found his on the armrest, and she didn't let go. By mid-June, the second room was finished. They filled it with shelves, quilts, baskets of dry herbs, and one rocking chair Silas had carved without telling her. He placed it near the window, where morning light came in soft and gold. "You needed a place to think," he said simply. Nora ran her hand along the armrest, then leaned down and kissed his cheek. It was the first time she kissed him without hesitation. He turned to her, touched her jaw with his calloused fingers, and said, "You can take my name, if you want." She looked at him. "I already took your coffee, your tools, your socks. I suppose your name is next." That made him laugh, that low, deep sound she had learned to wait for. He kissed her then, not like a cowboy or a storybook lover, but like a man who had learned the value of quiet moments, and didn't need permission to finally have one. They didn't marry, not officially, but when the preacher passed through town and asked if they needed anything blessed, Nora said, "Just the porch swing." And he did, with a crooked smile and a few drops of river water. Summer stretched long and generous. Their routine deepened. She taught Silas how to make biscuits. He burned the first 3 trays and kept the 4th like a trophy. He taught her how to saddle the mule without swearing. They learned when to speak and when not to, when to lean in, when to let silence hold the space. And then, one afternoon in late July, a man came riding down the road. He wore a bowler hat and a coat too fine for the heat. He carried a valise and eyes that searched everything too quickly. Nora saw him from the kitchen window and froze. Silas came up behind her, touched her shoulder. "Is it someone you know?" She nodded. "A cousin. By marriage. And if he's here, it's not for the weather." They waited on the porch. The man dismounted, wiped his forehead, and said, "Miss Elwood, or is it Mrs. Hart now?" Nora's jaw tightened. "Depends who's asking." He opened the case and pulled out a folder. "My firm represents the estate of your late husband. We've been instructed to retrieve your signature retroactively on several documents. There's a sum involved." Silence. Nora looked at Silas, then back at the man. "There's nothing left in that life for me." She paused, "except maybe a lesson or two." The man frowned. "The estate requires closure." Nora stood up. "So does grief. But I've already done my part." She turned, walked back inside. Silas stood, folding his arms across his chest. "You can ride back the way you came." The man hesitated. "Is that a threat?" Silas's voice was quiet. "That's a weather report." The man left. They watched him vanish into the haze of the trail. That night, Nora couldn't sleep. She sat in the rocking chair, turning the silver spoon over in her hands. Silas joined her, barefoot, hair tousled. "You don't have to look back," he said. She nodded. "I'm not looking back. I'm just making sure it's really gone." In the weeks after, the rhythm returned, but there was something different, a deepening, like roots finally reaching the water table. She began writing letters again, some to friends long forgotten, others to no one in particular. Sometimes she'd write her name at the bottom, Nora Elwood Hart, and each time it felt a little more like something true. One day, she returned from the well with a bucket and found Silas sitting on the porch steps, a piece of paper in his hands. He looked up. "I wrote something." She blinked. "You wrote?" He held it out. "I thought maybe we'd carve it into a board. Hang it above the kitchen." She read it. "Home isn't built in a day or in one storm or one kiss. Home is built in the way someone remembers how you like your coffee and hangs your coat in the spot you always reach. It's built in the pause between words and the way someone sits beside you when you can't find them." Nora read it twice, then a third time, then folded it and tucked it in her apron pocket. "We'll carve it together," she said. That evening, the wind changed. It carried the smell of river dust and pine smoke and something else, something clean and old. As they sat on the porch, she leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "I never thought I'd be someone who got to stay." Silas didn't reply right away. Then, softly, he said, "You weren't someone who stayed. You were someone worth waiting for." By the time August faded, their days began to move slower, not from age, not from weariness, but from something fuller. It was the kind of slow that came after a long winter or a long fight, when the body finally lets itself rest, when the soul realizes it no longer has to keep the doors locked. They harvested the last of the herbs. Nora braided the rosemary into little bundles and hung them from the rafters. Silas restacked the woodpile with care, whistling to himself when he thought no one was listening. One morning, Nora found herself watching the horizon longer than usual. The air had changed. It wasn't cold yet, but it held the scent of mornings that would be. She poured 2 mugs of coffee and stood barefoot on the porch, letting the rising steam meet the morning light. Silas joined her, wrapping his arm around her waist without a word. They stood like that until the sun broke through the mist. That afternoon, they cleared space in the second room, the one that had started as shelves and storage. Nora had an idea. "A table," she said, "for sewing, and maybe letters." Silas brought in the one he'd made years ago and never used. Together, they set it beneath the window. She laid out her scissors, spools, and a little tin of buttons she'd saved from her mother's apron. When the light hit just right, it made her needles shine like stars. Silas leaned in the doorway and said, "You look like you've always belonged here." Nora didn't reply. She just smiled, took a square of fabric, and began to stitch. The first snow came early that year, just a dusting, quiet and pale. Nora stepped outside that morning, letting the flakes land on her hair, her sleeves. The ground looked cleaner, somehow, like someone had come in the night and forgiven the dirt. She found Silas already up, lighting the fire in the main house, stirring a pot of beans that had soaked overnight. He handed her a spoon to taste. She nodded. "Needs a little salt." He grinned. "I was waiting for you to say it." After breakfast, they sat near the fire, each with a cup of tea, each holding something. Nora had her stitching. Silas was whittling a small bird from a piece of cedar. They didn't need conversation. Their presence was enough. But eventually, Nora asked, "Do you ever wonder what people back in town think of us?" Silas shrugged. They probably think we built a life out of quiet and cornbread. That made her laugh, low, gentle, warm. I'd be fine with that. One day, Nora received a letter, not a legal one, not a summons or a threat. It came with no return address, only the initials LE on the back. She opened it on the porch with Silas watching from inside. The handwriting was elegant, steady. It read, "Nora, I heard you'd gone west. I always wondered if you'd find something better than what we were given. I hope you did. Ellie." She read it twice, folded it slowly, and didn't speak of it. Instead, she went inside, kissed Silas on the temple, and said, "The past sends strange letters, but it doesn't change the bread I need to bake today." He didn't ask. He just nodded. By November, the wind had picked up. They lined the windows with cloth, packed straw around the foundation, and moved the bunkhouse stove into the main room for added warmth. Their world grew smaller. Rooms lit only by firelight. Soup shared from a single pot. Days where the most important thing was whether the kettle would whistle before the bread finished rising. And in that slow season, they made things. Silas carved more birds. Nora stitched quilts that told stories only the two of them could read. A piece of sky here, a square of storm, a border sewn with little rosemary branches. She hung one of the finished quilts on the wall and said, "I think we're starting to remember things that haven't even happened yet." Silas leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. That's how you know it's home. That December, a child from town brought a basket of apples as a thank you. His sister had been ill, and Nora's tonic of honey and mint had eased her cough. Silas carved the boy a little rabbit and gave it to him without ceremony. When the boy asked if they had children of their own, Nora only smiled. Not yet. But sometimes, a life is full even without echoes. That night, Nora sat by the window, watching the snowfall drift down like slow ash. Silas stood behind her, arms folded. She turned. "Do you miss anything from before?" He took a breath. "Sometimes I miss not knowing how good life could be, because now the idea of losing it is a little harder." She reached for his hand. "Then we don't lose it. We live it. Every quiet piece." Winter came thick and long that year. Snow piled against the cabin steps. The wind whistled through the cottonwoods, low and steady, like a song hummed from the belly of the land. Nora wrapped the rosemary bundles tighter, sealed the windows with stitched muslin, and baked more often, not just for warmth, but because bread rising was the only heartbeat she could control. Silas kept the fire going. He sharpened tools that didn't need sharpening and mended the same pair of boots 3 times, more out of habit than need. One morning, as the snow fell in thick curtains outside, he said, "I used to hate this season." She looked up from her cup of tea. Why? Because it made everything slow down. And when things got quiet, all the ghosts talked at once. Nora sipped, held the silence a moment, then said, "And now? Now it's just your spoon scraping the pot. And that's better than most ghosts." That made him chuckle, the soft kind that lifted his shoulders but barely left his lips. They started reading aloud in the evenings, old letters, newspaper scraps, even the sewing instructions on fabric packaging. Nora read with a voice that changed depending on the light. Silas listened with a stillness that felt like reverence. Sometimes she'd stop mid-sentence just to see if he was still with her. He always was. One night, she asked, "Do you dream?" He nodded. "Not always." But when I do, it's never about what I've lost. It's about things I haven't seen yet. Like what? He paused. You in the spring, wearing something green, laughing by the river. She looked at him long and quiet. That sounds like something we could make happen. He smiled. Then I suppose we'd better get through this snow. They talked about building a new barn come April, about painting the porch again, about planting something new, maybe tomatoes this time, or onions. Silas said he'd build her a second rocking chair. She told him she'd sew him a coat lined with fleece. He said he'd wear it even if it made him itch. She said she'd make tea to soothe the rash. They didn't plan everything, but they planned enough. Then one morning, there was blood. Silas returned from chopping wood with a deep cut down the back of his hand. Not a clean one, a splintered, angry thing. Nora made him sit while she boiled water, threaded her needle, tore muslin into strips. She didn't flinch, didn't scold, just cleaned, stitched, wrapped. His jaw clenched, not from pain, but from the fact that she did it without trembling. She'd done this before, too many times. She didn't say who else she'd bandaged. He didn't ask. When it was done, he said, "Thank you," she replied. "You're mine to keep together now." He watched her pack away the thread and whispered, "I didn't know what that would feel like." She placed the scissors in the tin and said, "You'll know more tomorrow. That's the thing about staying. It teaches you slowly." The snow didn't stop, but their world inside kept warm. Each day was measured in small gestures, a new stew recipe, a shared blanket, one more nail in the shelf he promised to finish before spring. They began carving initials in the underside of the table, not theirs, just letters. For days they wanted to remember. She carved a little J for the time he made jam from dried berries and sugar, and it worked. He carved C for the first time she cried without hiding it. And in the quiet of those days, the ghosts went quiet too. Silas no longer sharpened things just to stay busy. Nora no longer touched the silver spoon at night. They both stopped checking the road from town. One afternoon, while she was mending the hem of a coat that wasn't even torn, Nora looked up and said, "I think I want to write to Emmeline." Silas set down his book. "Who's that?" "The woman I used to be when I was 15. He smiled. "She deserves a letter." Nora nodded. "I'll tell her we made it. That we're okay. That she can stop running." The letter took 3 days to finish. She folded it neatly and left it in the window, where the sun would hit it first. That night, she sat in the chair by the fire, feet tucked beneath her, eyes half closed. Silas sat across from her, holding the unfinished bird he'd been carving for weeks. "It's almost done," he said. She nodded. "I think we are too." He frowned. "Done?" "No." She smiled, just settled. They didn't touch often, not in the way stories tell you lovers do, but their nearness had weight, like gravity, like rain about to fall. And every time Silas walked past her, every time he handed her a cup of tea or a folded blanket, he did it with the same care a man gives to fire on a cold night, knowing how easily it can vanish, and how badly you need it to stay lit. By March, the snow began to groan in the early light, giving way to earth again. The drip from the roof became a rhythm, and Nora said, "It sounds like forgiveness." Silas looked out over the field, muddy and waiting. "You always make it sound better than it is." She smiled. "Maybe it's just that I've waited long enough to notice." They cleaned the cabin together, not because it was dirty, but because it felt right. Silas opened the windows for the first time in weeks. Cold air rushed in, biting their fingers, but they didn't close them. "Let it blow out the old ghosts," he said. Nora didn't reply. She was already sweeping. The ground softened. The mule stomped at the fence line. Birds returned, curious and loud. Nora hung the quilt she finished during the longest storm out on the line. The wind lifted it high, then dropped it again like a sigh. Silas stood in the yard, hands on his hips. "You made that." During the week, we didn't speak. She nodded. "And still, you brought me tea." He shrugged. "You were the only thing worth making warm." One afternoon, they walked to the river. Nora hadn't been since October. The trees there were bare but waking. The water ran high, tugging at everything in its way. She took off her shoes and stepped in, shivering. Silas sat on a rock and watched her laugh. "That green dress you dreamed of?" she asked. "I'll make it before June." He tipped his hat back. "If it turns out anything like your biscuits, I'll wear a suit to match." That night, they sat with the ledger book, flipping through the notes they'd kept, lists, harvest tallies, letters never sent. In the margin of one page, Silas had written something Nora hadn't seen before. "Nora is a house. Safe, quiet, always warm." She didn't ask when he wrote it. She just traced it once, then closed the book. The first thunderstorm came in April, not a violent one, just enough to rattle the window and remind them the sky still had things to say. They didn't run this time. They sat by the fire, listening. Nora held a candle between her palms. Silas stared into the flames. After a while, he said, "The first time I saw you, you were holding a spoon like it was a weapon." She turned to him. "The first time I saw you, I thought you looked like a man who hadn't been spoken to kindly in years." He didn't deny it. And then came the moment they didn't expect. A writer with a telegram. No name, just a message. "Letter en route from England. Marked urgent. Sender unknown." Nora held it between her fingers. Thin as ash. She didn't open it. Not right away. Instead, she stood at the stove, stirred a pot of beans, poured tea, washed the cups. When she finally opened it, Silas sat nearby, silent. The letter was from Emmeline. She wrote of her own winter, of years wondering, of a hallway back in London where silence grew louder than footsteps. "I thought you were lost," she wrote. "Then I heard about a woman in Wyoming who stitched curtains with blue thread and baked rosemary bread during snowstorms. I knew it was you." Nora read it 3 times, then handed it to Silas. He didn't ask anything. He just said, "Want to write her back?" "Yes," Nora said. "Not tomorrow, but soon." The days grew long again. Silas built a second garden bed. Nora planted lavender and marigold. She caught him watching her once, hands on his belt, face unreadable. "What?" she asked. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Just thinking, you're not what I expected." She walked to him, took his hand, placed it against her cheek. "And yet, you built me a home before I earned it." He nodded. "Because you walked in like you already belonged." They hung a small bell by the front door, not to announce visitors, just to remind themselves that people still came and went, that life still arrived in small sounds. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the far hills, Nora sat on the porch and said, "If this were a story, they'd say we survived the hard part." Silas joined her, placing 2 mugs on the step. "If this were a story, they'd fade out here." She looked at him. "But we're still living it." He nodded. "That's the best part." The light turned gold, then blue. The bell at the door didn't ring, but something inside them did. Summer returned without thunder. It came in slow mornings. In the hush of breeze lifting the curtains Nora had stitched last winter, in the creak of the rocking chair when neither of them were in it, the cabin felt full, not with sound, but with the memory of sound, cups set on wood, the scrape of boots near the door, soft laughter traded like goods. They didn't mark a specific day as an anniversary, but when the heat settled into the walls and the river ran low, Nora baked a pie she hadn't made since the year before. Silas cut wildflowers from the field and left them in a chipped mug on the table. No words passed between them about the meaning. The gestures spoke louder. On a morning full of flies and sun, Nora received another letter. Emmeline again. This one shorter. "I'm getting older. My hands shake more than they used to. But I read your last letter 5 times. I think I believe in quiet now, because of you." Nora folded the page and placed it with the others, in the drawer where she kept her old thread and the first note Silas ever wrote her. Later, she read it aloud while they shelled beans together. Silas said, "I hope she visits someday." Nora nodded. "I think she already has, in the things I remember softer." In late July, Silas finished carving the last bird. A hawk, wings spread, eyes carved deep and steady. He placed it on the mantel above the hearth. It was the only one that looked like it was flying. Nora ran her fingers along its feathers. "You never told me what this one was for." Silas shrugged. "It's not for anything. Just felt like something that needed to exist." That night, she laid in bed beside him and whispered, "I'm not afraid of winter anymore." He turned toward her, voice low against the quiet. "That's how I know we're home." When the first frost returned, they moved slower, not because of age, but because they knew how much could be missed when things were rushed. They spent whole afternoons reading old recipes aloud, wondering how people used to live on so little. They walked to the creek more often, sat longer when the porch swing creaked in the wind, watched storms before closing the shutters. Then came the day that felt like a book ending, though nothing dramatic happened. Nora woke early, fed the chickens, folded the blue dress she hadn't worn in months, and sat by the fire with tea. Silas joined her. They didn't speak for almost an hour. Finally, she looked at him and said, "If this is the last chapter, I'd still rather live in it than any story that came before." He reached for her hand, rubbed his thumb along the calluses on her fingers. "Then let's not call it the last. Let's just keep turning pages." They stayed that way until the fire went to coals. By the second snow, their porch was lined with stacked firewood and the scent of dry sage. The wind blew cold, but not cruel. They played cards by lantern light. Sometimes Silas lost on purpose. Sometimes Nora let him win. They built a small bookshelf together in December, and when it was done, she wrote on the side with pencil, "For the stories that stay." Nora never wore a wedding ring, but she carried the spoon still, now polished and tucked in the drawer with the letters and thread. Sometimes she'd take it out just to feel the weight of where she came from. Then she'd stir something, beans, tea, memory, and put it back. Silas never asked for promises, but every time she folded laundry or placed his boots by the door or left a cup of coffee waiting for him, he gave her a look that said, "I see what you give, and I keep it." One night, when the air outside was sharp and the fire inside was kind, she asked, "What if I hadn't taken that job at Buckley's place?" Silas leaned his head back. Then some other man might still be eating cold stew in silence, and I'd be one bird short on that shelf. She laughed, and I'd still be stitching curtains for windows that don't deserve them. He turned toward her, eyes soft in the firelight. We didn't meet by accident. We met because the wind knew we were finally done running. When spring came again, they didn't celebrate. They just planted carrots, painted the railing again, built a third garden bed. And one morning, while the wind was soft and the sky just beginning to pale with sun, Nora stood on the porch, held her warm mug in both hands, and whispered into the still air, "I stayed." Not as a guest. Not as a second chance. Not as someone who was once small, but as someone who built a life from bread and blue thread and the quiet way a man held her name. And the wind answered her, not with sound, but with stillness, the kind that says, "Yes, I know." And inside the cabin, Silas poured her second cup without needing to be asked.